I want you to picture this: a ballroom, 200 people in cocktail dresses and pressed suits, string lights strung across the ceiling, a jazz trio playing something soft in the corner. My husband's 12th anniversary business gala, the night he'd been planning for 6 months. The night he was going to announce his new partner. He didn't mean business partner. Not really. Not in the way everyone in that room thought. I was standing by the bar in a navy blue dress he'd never seen, holding a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, watching my husband of 14 years walk across that room with his hand resting on the small of a 29-year-old woman's back like he'd done it 1,000 times. Because he had. Here's the thing nobody in that room knew. Not my husband, not her, not one single person clinking glasses under those string lights. 3 months earlier, I'd already met with a divorce attorney. I'd already had a forensic accountant quietly go through 18 months of business records. I'd already moved money, changed beneficiaries, and had documents drafted and notarized, sitting in a safe deposit box 2 towns over. I hadn't said a word to my husband, not one word, because that night, the night he stood up at that podium, tapped his glass, and opened his mouth to make an announcement that was going to blow up his own life, I was 1 sentence away from doing it first. And when it was over, she thought she'd won everything. She had no idea what was actually coming. Stick with me, because by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly what it means to smile at someone while you're already holding the paperwork that ends them. Hey. Welcome back. If you're new here, I tell true stories of betrayal, revenge, and the moment someone finally stops being the victim in their own life. If that's your kind of story, and judging by the fact that you clicked on this one, I think it is, do me a favor and hit subscribe before we get going, because trust me, you do not want to miss the second half of this one. I'm going to warn you right now, this gets so much worse before it gets better. There's a moment about halfway through where I found something in my husband's business account that made me physically sick. There's a twist near the end involving the other woman that I promise you will not see coming. I didn't see it coming, and I lived it. But it also gets better. Much, much better. By the end of this story, you are going to want to stand up and cheer. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me take you back to the beginning. Back before any of this happened, back when I still thought I had a normal, happy marriage. My name is Rachel, and this is the story of how I found out my husband was cheating, and how I made sure that when the truth came out, it came out entirely on my terms. Mark and I met when I was 26. I was working as a project coordinator at a mid-sized architecture firm, and he was this loud, funny, ridiculously charming guy who came in to pitch our office on a branding refresh. He wore a blazer that didn't quite fit him right, and he tripped over the leg of a conference table in front of the entire executive team. And instead of being embarrassed, he just laughed and said, "Well, that's the last time I wear my brother's shoes to a pitch meeting." I laughed so hard I had to leave the room. We started dating 3 weeks later, and for a long time, it was good, really good. Mark had this energy about him. He wanted to build something. He'd started his own small marketing agency 2 years before I met him, working out of a shared office space with 2 folding tables and a single overworked laptop, and he used to talk about it like it was going to be this massive thing someday. I believed him. I believed in him. When we got married, I was 29. I remember standing at the altar thinking, this is the easiest decision I have ever made in my life. For the first several years, that feeling didn't go away. We built a life together in the kind of unglamorous, everyday way that actually matters. I went back to school part-time and got my CPA license while working full-time. Mark's agency grew, slowly at first, then faster, until he had a real office, a real staff, real clients with real budgets. And here's something you need to understand about our marriage, because it matters a lot later. I wasn't just his wife. I was, in a very real sense, his first investor. When Mark's agency was in its 2nd year and almost went under, A client didn't pay a massive invoice and payroll was about to bounce. I took $18,000 out of my own savings, money I had before we even got married, and I loaned it to the business. Not gave, loaned. And because I was already a numbers person even before I had my license, I insisted we put it in writing. A real loan agreement, real terms. Mark thought it was funny at the time. You're really going to make your own husband sign a contract?
I'm not your wife in this conversation, I told him. I'm your creditor. He signed it, and more importantly, and I want you to remember this detail because it becomes very, very important later in the story, as part of that agreement, I became a minority equity holder in his company, 8%. It was supposed to be a formality, a thank you. Neither of us thought it would ever matter. Neither of us thought a lot of things. The years went on. We had a comfortable life, not extravagant, but comfortable. No kids, which was something we'd decided together, and something that in hindsight I'm grateful for, though I never would have said that at the time. We had a golden retriever named Biscuit. We had a house we'd renovated ourselves, room by room over 6 years. We had inside jokes and a Sunday morning routine and a whole language of shorthand that only two people who've spent a decade together can develop. I want to be honest with you. I was happy. I know how these stories usually go. Looking back, the signs were everywhere, and I promise you, some of them were. But I need you to understand that for most of our marriage, I was genuinely, unambiguously happy. This isn't a story about a miserable marriage. It's a story about a good one that got destroyed by one person's choices. That matters. Hold on to that. The agency kept growing. By year 10 of our marriage, Mark had 30 employees and a client roster that included 2 companies you'd actually recognize if I said their names, which I won't for obvious reasons. He was proud of what he built. I was proud of him. I still did the books for the business on the side, informally, as a favor, because I trusted the process and honestly, I liked staying close to it. It felt like our thing, even though it was legally his company. That's an important detail too. Write it down. Now, the red flags, because you're waiting for them and you're right to be. Looking back, the first one showed up about 18 months before everything blew up. Mark hired a new junior strategist. Her name was Vanessa. I met her exactly once at a company holiday party, maybe 4 months after she started. She was polished in this very deliberate way, not flashy, but every single detail calculated. The kind of woman who says, "Oh, this old thing," about an outfit that clearly cost $400. She shook my hand, told me it was so nice to finally meet the woman behind the man, and smiled at me in a way that I remember thinking was just slightly too long. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Genuinely, I want to be honest with you. I wasn't the suspicious type. I trusted my husband completely. But Mark started mentioning her name a lot after that. Vanessa had this great idea. Vanessa has been putting in crazy hours. Vanessa thinks we should pitch the Hendricks account differently. At first, it was just normal, work talk. Every boss has an employee they're impressed by. I even remember telling a friend, half joking, "I think Mark has a work crush, but it's the harmless kind. He just likes that she's smart." The harmless kind. God, I actually said that out loud. Here's red flag number 2. And this one I really should have caught. Mark started working later. Not dramatically later, nothing that screamed alarm bells, just an extra hour here, an extra hour there, a big pitch that required weekend prep, a team dinner that ran long. Each individual instance was completely explainable. That's the thing about this kind of betrayal. It never gives you one big red flag you can point to. It gives you 100 tiny ones, each easy to explain away on its own. Red flag number 3, he started caring how he looked in a way he hadn't in years. New shirts, a gym membership he actually used consistently for the first time in a decade, a haircut every 3 weeks instead of every 2 months. I noticed.
I remember noticing, and I remember thinking, this is genuinely what I thought. Good for him, he's taking care of himself. I was happy for him. I even told him how good he looked. I told my husband he looked good while he was getting ready to see another woman. I think about that a lot. There's one more moment from this period I need to tell you about, because it's the one that haunts me the most in hindsight. It was a Tuesday night, maybe 14 months before everything came out. Mark came home late, later than usual, and he was in an unusually good mood, almost giddy. He made us dinner, which he hadn't done in months, and he was affectionate in this performative way, like he was trying to prove something to himself. I asked him what had him in such a good mood. He said, "I just feel like things are finally clicking at work, like everything's coming together." I believed him completely. I remember going to bed that night feeling grateful, feeling like our life together was entering some kind of golden season. That was the night I would find out much, much later from a hotel receipt buried in a business expense account. That was the exact night he and Vanessa first slept together. I need you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to sit with it. He came home from being unfaithful to me for the first time, and he was in a good mood, and he made me dinner, and I felt grateful. That's not a coincidence, by the way. That's a pattern you'll see with people capable of this kind of betrayal. The guilt doesn't make them distant. Sometimes it makes them more present, more affectionate, almost manic, because some twisted part of them is trying to balance the scales, or maybe just trying to convince themselves they're not the person they know they're becoming. For the next several months, life continued on the surface like nothing was wrong. We took a trip to the coast for our anniversary. We talked about redoing the kitchen. We were, by any outside measure, a normal, functioning, happy married couple. But underneath that surface, something had already shifted, and I just didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. Mark started being weird about his phone. Nothing dramatic, he'd just angle it away from me at the dinner table, or take it into the bathroom when it buzzed, or once snap at me. Actually snap, which he never did, when I picked it up off the counter to check the time. "Do you mind?" he said, sharp, immediate. I remember standing there, phone in my hand, completely confused, because I hadn't even unlocked it. I was just checking the clock on the lock screen. I put it down and didn't bring it up again. I told myself he was stressed, work stress. The agency had just landed a huge new client, a real coup, honestly, the kind of account that could double their revenue. And I told myself the tension I was sensing was just pressure from that deal. I want to pause here and say something directly to you, whoever's listening to this. If you've ever felt that specific, quiet unease, the kind where nothing is technically wrong, but something in your gut is whispering that something's off, please, please trust that feeling sooner than I did. I ignored mine for almost a full year. I don't say that with shame anymore. I say it because I know some of you are living in that exact fog right now, and I want you to hear someone say, "You're not crazy. Pay attention." The last piece of foreshadowing I want to give you before we move into the part of this story where everything breaks wide open, because it did break, and soon, happened at that same huge new client's kickoff dinner. Mark invited me along, which was unusual. He almost never brought me to work events unless they were the big annual parties. I sat at a table near the end, making small talk with account managers I barely knew, and at some point I looked up and saw Mark across the room, laughing at something Vanessa had said, his hand resting, just for a second, just barely, on her shoulder. It was nothing. It was completely explainable. Colleagues touch shoulders. Colleagues laugh at each other's jokes. But something in me went cold and still for exactly 3 seconds, and then the feeling passed, and I told myself I was being paranoid, and I finished my wine and went home with my husband, and I fell asleep next to him like everything was fine. It wasn't fine. It hadn't been fine for over a year. I just didn't know it yet. But I was about to find out, And when I did, it wasn't gentle. It wasn't a slow, dawning realization. It hit me like a car crash on a random Thursday afternoon when I wasn't even looking for it. That's next. It was a Thursday in April. I remember the date exactly. I will always remember the date, but I'm not going to say it out loud because some details I'm keeping for myself. What I will tell you is that it was an ordinary, unremarkable Thursday afternoon, and I was sitting at my kitchen table doing something I had done 100 times before without incident, reconciling the agency's quarterly expense reports. I told you I still did the books, informally, as a favor. That habit, that one small, loyal habit, is the exact thing that ended up handing me the truth. I was cross-referencing credit card statements against the expense categories Mark's bookkeeper had logged, just double-checking everything matched before quarterly taxes, something I'd done every single quarter for years without finding so much as a mismatched decimal point. And then I found a charge, $640, a hotel. Not a hotel near any client office, not a hotel near any conference Mark had mentioned, a boutique hotel 40 minutes outside the city, in a small town we had literally never once talked about visiting, logged as client entertainment, Hendrick's account. I stared at it for a long time. My first instinct, genuinely my very first instinct, was that it was a mistake, a miscoded expense. I actually opened my laptop and looked up the hotel, thinking maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe a client meeting had happened there. Maybe I was about to feel silly for even wondering.
The hotel's website loaded. Boutique, adults only. A tagline about romantic getaways front and center on the homepage. My stomach dropped in a way I can only describe as physical, not a metaphor, an actual physical sensation like the floor of my body had opened up. I told myself, one charge doesn't mean anything. Maybe it really was a mistake in the coding. Maybe someone else on staff had used the company card. I needed more information before I let my mind go somewhere I couldn't come back from. So I did what I do. I'm an accountant. When I don't understand a number, I don't panic, I investigate. I spent the next 4 hours going back through 18 months of expense reports, line by line, charge by charge. And once I knew what I was looking for, I started seeing it everywhere. A florist delivery coded as client gift on a date I recognized as Vanessa's birthday, which I only knew because it had come up once at a company party. A $400 dinner at a restaurant I'd never been to, coded as team building on a night Mark told me he was working late alone, prepping a pitch deck. 2 more hotel charges, same chain, different locations, both coded as client-related, both near towns with no clients. A jewelry store charge for $1,100 that I never received a single item from. I want to tell you what that moment felt like, sitting alone at my kitchen table with my laptop open and 18 months of evidence laid out in front of me like a crime scene, because I think some of you watching this have felt it too, or will someday, and I don't think we talk about it honestly enough. It didn't feel like sadness, not at first. It felt like the entire architecture of my life, the last decade and a half, every memory, every inside joke, every I love you, instantly became suspect. I sat there and I thought, was any of it real? Was our anniversary trip real, or was he already thinking about her the whole time? Was the night he made me dinner and seemed so happy, was that even about us? I didn't cry right away. I want to be honest about that because I think it surprises people. I sat completely still for almost 45 minutes, just staring at the screen, feeling something I can only describe as a kind of internal freefall. And then Biscuit, our dog, came and put his head in my lap, the way he always did when something in the house felt wrong, and that's when I broke. I cried the kind of crying that comes from somewhere below your ribs, the kind that makes it hard to breathe.
sitting on my kitchen floor with my dog's head in my lap at 4 in the afternoon, completely alone. I know a lot of you have been there. I see your comments on videos like this one. I know some of you are there right now, watching this from a place of raw, recent pain. I want you to know, genuinely, I see you, and I promise you, there is a version of this where you come out the other side stronger than you ever thought you could be. I'm proof of that. Keep watching. I'm going to show you exactly how. Now, here's where I need to tell you something about myself that changed the entire trajectory of this story. I am, by profession and by nature, a person who does not make big decisions on emotion. It's a professional habit that bled into my whole personality. When I see a problem, my instinct isn't to react. It's to gather every piece of information before I move. So instead of calling Mark and screaming at him, which, believe me, some primal part of me wanted to do more than I have ever wanted to do anything, I closed my laptop, I splashed water on my face, I fed the dog, and when Mark came home 2 hours later, cheerful, kissing me hello like it was any other Thursday, I looked him directly in the eyes and said, "How was your day?" And he said, "Good. Long, but good." I did not let one single flicker of what I now knew show on my face. I need you to understand, that was not me being weak, and it was not me being naive. That was the first calculated decision of this entire story. I knew, in that moment, sitting across the table from a man I had loved for 14 years, eating a dinner I don't remember the taste of, that I was not going to give him the satisfaction of an emotional reaction he could spin, minimize, or gaslight his way out of. I wanted proof, airtight, undeniable, comprehensive proof, because I already knew, some cold, clear part of my brain already knew that a man capable of hiding this for over a year was a man capable of lying his way through a confrontation too. Over the next 3 weeks, I became a detective in my own marriage. I'm not going to walk you through every single method because some of what I did carefully and legally, and I want to be responsible about what I share. But I'll tell you the broad strokes. I pulled every piece of shared financial history I had legal access to, as both a wife and a minority equity holder in the business, which, remember that 8% I told you about? That 8% was about to become the most important number in this entire story. I quietly reached out to a forensic accountant I'd known professionally for years, someone I trusted completely, and asked her, off the record at first, to help me understand what I was looking at. And I found more, so much more. Here is the moment I want to slow down for, because this is the "I can't believe this" moment I promised you at the start. The forensic accountant I hired found something in the agency's books that went far beyond an affair. Mark had been funneling money out of the business, not enormous amounts at any one time, small enough to avoid scrutiny from anyone not specifically looking for it, but consistent, deliberate, and dressed up as legitimate expenses. Client dinners that never happened, consulting fees paid to a shell entity that, when we traced it, led back to an apartment lease. An apartment in the city that Mark had been quietly paying for through the business for the last 8 months. He wasn't just cheating on me emotionally and physically, he was using company funds that I, as an 8% equity holder, had a legal stake in, to bankroll an entire secret second life with another woman. I remember calling my accountant friend back after she sent me that report and just saying, "Say that again. Say it slower." I needed to hear it a second time because my brain genuinely could not process it the first time. An apartment. He'd set up an apartment for Vanessa, furnished it, paid the utilities, all coded, quietly, as business expenses, buried in a general operating line that no external auditor would ever have flagged. I sat there with that information and felt something shift inside me. The grief didn't disappear. It never fully disappears, if I'm being honest with you, but it started sharing space with something else, something colder, something with edges.
Because here's what I understood in that exact moment, sitting at my kitchen table for the second time in a month with my entire life laid bare in front of me. This wasn't just betrayal. This was theft. This was fraud. This was a man who had decided that not only did I not deserve honesty, I didn't even deserve the money I'd helped him build a life on. I want to talk about her for a minute, about Vanessa, because I think it's important, before we get into what I did next, that you understand what kind of manipulation was happening on her end too. Not to excuse Mark, not even slightly, but because I think a lot of you have dealt with someone like her, and I think it helps to name the pattern.
Through the messages I eventually recovered, and I'll get into exactly how, because it matters, I learned that Vanessa hadn't stumbled into this. She'd cultivated it, patiently, over more than a year. Small compliments that escalated, manufactured work crises late at night that required Mark's personal attention, a carefully constructed persona of being endlessly understanding, endlessly available, in constant, deliberate contrast to me, a wife who was, in her words, in one message I later saw, too busy with her own career to really see him. I built a career while raising a business alongside my husband and running our household, and somehow in her narrative, that made me the neglectful one. That's the manipulation you need to watch for. It's never framed as, I'm going to destroy this marriage. It's framed as, I understand you in a way she doesn't. It's framed as sympathy, as rescue, as if breaking apart someone else's family is an act of compassion instead of what it actually is. I found a message from Vanessa to Mark, sent about 2 months before I discovered any of this, that I still think about. She wrote, "She doesn't even see what she has. I would never let you feel unappreciated like that." Let that sink in for a second. This woman had never spent a single Sunday morning with us, never seen 14 years of history, never seen the $18,000 I handed over to save his company when it was failing, or the loan agreement I insisted on, or the 10 years of quarterly books I did for free out of love and loyalty. And she had the audacity to decide from the outside that I didn't appreciate my husband. I want to be very clear about something, because it's easy to make this story only about Mark. Vanessa was not some innocent bystander swept up by a charming older man. She was an active, willing, strategic participant in the destruction of my marriage, and, as I'd soon learn, she'd done something disturbingly similar before, to someone else. But we'll get to that. By this point, 3.5 weeks after finding that first hotel charge, I had everything. Financial records, message threads, the apartment lease, screenshots, a full, professionally organized report from my forensic accountant that laid out in cold and undeniable numbers exactly how much money had been diverted and exactly where it had gone. I had every legal and moral right in that moment to walk into Mark's office, throw it all on his desk, and scream at him in front of his entire staff. I didn't do that. Instead, I sat alone in my car in the parking lot of my accountant friend's office, holding a manila folder containing the complete, documented unraveling of my marriage, and I made a decision that changed the entire rest of this story. I decided I wasn't going to react. I was going to plan. Because here's the thing I understood with absolute clarity in that parking lot. If I confronted Mark right then with raw emotion, he would have time to hide assets, coach his story, delete evidence, and turn this into a he said, she said mess that would drag on for years and cost me everything I'd helped build. But if I stayed quiet, if I let him believe for just a little longer that his secret was still safe, I could build something he couldn't undo. A case, a plan, an ending on my terms instead of his. Every 8 to 10 minutes I'm going to pause and remind you of something, because I promised you at the start of this video that it gets so much worse before it gets better, and I meant it. What I found next, what I did next, is the part of this story that turns from heartbreak into something else entirely.
But what happened next, I never saw coming. Let's talk about the plan. I want to start this part of the story by telling you something that surprised even me. Food, once it's had its moment, can turn into the most efficient fuel you've ever had. I didn't sleep well those first few weeks after discovering everything. How could I? But the hours I used to spend awake at 3 a.m. crying, I slowly started spending awake at 3 a.m. planning. The first thing I did, the very first call I made, was to a divorce attorney. Not just any divorce attorney. I specifically sought out someone who specialized in high-asset divorces involving closely held businesses, because I understood, even in my grief, that this case was never going to be simple. My husband's entire net worth was tangled up in a company, and I needed someone who ate cases like this for breakfast. Her name doesn't matter for this story, but I'll tell you she was one of the sharpest people I have ever spoken to in my life. In our first consultation, I laid out everything: the affair, the hotel charges, the shell apartment, the diverted funds, my 8% equity stake, and I watched her expression shift from professional neutrality to something closer to genuine excitement. "Do you understand what you're sitting on?" she asked me. I told her I understood some of it. I understood the affair was going to end my marriage. What I didn't fully understand yet was the leverage.
She explained it to me slowly, and I'm going to explain it to you the same way, because it's the key to this entire story. First, because I was a minority equity holder in Mark's company, remember 8% from that loan agreement over a decade earlier, Mark's use of company funds to bankroll his affair wasn't just a marital betrayal, it was potentially a breach of fiduciary duty to the other shareholders, which included me in a professional capacity separate from our marriage entirely. Second, in our state, dissipation of marital assets, meaning spending shared money on an affair, is something a court can absolutely factor into how assets get divided in divorce. Every hotel room, every gift, every dollar of that apartment lease, all of it could be clawed back into the marital estate or used to argue for a larger share going to me. Third, and this was the part that made me sit back in my chair, my attorney explained that because I had documented, provable evidence of financial misconduct, not just infidelity, which courts in most states don't weigh heavily on its own, but actual fraud and diversion of funds, I had grounds to request emergency protective orders on shared accounts before Mark had any idea what was coming. In other words, she told me, you can freeze the water before he even knows the tide is turning. I left that first meeting with a folder of tasks, not a folder of feelings, a folder of tasks. And over the following weeks, I worked through every single one of them with the same discipline I bring to closing a set of books at the end of a fiscal quarter. Step 1, I opened a separate bank account in my name only at a bank Mark had never used, and I began quietly moving my personal savings, money that was unambiguously mine, inherited from my grandmother, kept separate our entire marriage specifically because I'd always been careful about that, somewhere he couldn't touch or even see. Step 2, my attorney helped me prepare but not yet file a petition for legal separation that included a request for a temporary restraining order on marital assets and business accounts, ready to submit the moment I decided to move. Step 3, and this is the one that still makes me feel something close to satisfaction when I think about it, I reached out to the other minority stakeholders in Mark's company. There were two, his younger brother, who held 5%, and a longtime family friend who'd invested early and held 4%. Between the three of us, we controlled 17% of the company. Not a majority, but enough under the operating agreement I had insisted on drafting all those years ago, the same agreement that gave me my 8%, to trigger a required vote on any allegation of financial misconduct by the managing partner, Mark. I hadn't just been sentimental when I made him sign that agreement over a decade earlier. I'd protected myself before I even knew I'd need protecting. I met with his brother first. That was the hardest conversation of this entire process, harder in some ways than anything else, because I had to tell someone who loved Mark, who'd looked up to him his whole life, exactly what he'd done. I brought the financial records. I laid it out calmly, the way I'd laid it out to myself. No screaming, no demanding he choose sides, just the numbers. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd first found that hotel charge, and he went pale reading through the report, and then he said something I will never forget. He used company money to cheat on you. That's not just betraying you, that's stealing from me too. He agreed to support the vote. So did the family friend once I showed her the same documentation, though she cried through most of our conversation, which I understood completely. I want to be honest with you about a near miss during this period, because this wasn't some flawless operation where everything went perfectly according to plan. About 5 weeks into this process, Mark almost caught me. I'd left my laptop open on the kitchen counter, a mistake, a real mistake, the kind that makes your whole body go cold when you realize it, with an email draft to my attorney still on the screen. I'd stepped away to answer the door for a delivery, and I came back to find Mark standing in the kitchen, home early, looking directly at my screen. My heart stopped, genuinely stopped, for what felt like a full 10 seconds. But, and this still amazes me when I think back on it, he wasn't actually reading it. He was scrolling through his own phone, glancing at my screen the way you glance at anything in a room without really registering it. He looked up, said, "Oh hey, I didn't hear you come down," and walked past me to the fridge. I closed the laptop so slowly, so carefully, that my hand was shaking the entire time. I went to the bathroom, sat on the edge of the tub, and just breathed for almost 5 full minutes. After that, I changed my entire approach. I stopped doing anything related to the case on any shared device. I got a separate laptop, kept in my car, used only in the parking lot of my attorney's office or at my sister's house. I changed all my passwords. I even, at my attorney's suggestion, had a security consultant do a basic sweep of my phone and car, just to make sure Mark hadn't installed any tracking software, which, by the way, is a real thing people do in these situations. And if any of you are in a similar spot, I'd urge you to think about that too. I had one more ally I haven't told you about yet, and honestly, she turned out to be the most important one of all. Her name was Denise. She was the office manager at Mark's agency, had been there almost since the beginning, long before Vanessa ever walked through the door. Denise had always liked me. We used to grab coffee together whenever I came by the office, and about 6 weeks into my investigation, in a moment of pure human vulnerability, I told her the truth. All of it. I want to be clear, I didn't manipulate her into helping me. I told her because I trusted her, and because I was exhausted from carrying this alone. What I didn't expect was her reaction. She went quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "I need to tell you something." Denise told me that about 4 months earlier, she'd fielded a strange phone call at the office, a woman asking pointed questions about Vanessa, about whether she was still working there, about whether Mark was still the managing partner. Denise had thought it was odd at the time and hadn't thought much more of it, but she'd written down the number out of habit. I asked her if she still had it. She did. I called that number 3 days later from a blocked line, my hands actually trembling as I dialed. A woman answered, and when I explained, carefully, gently, who I was and why I was calling, there was a long silence on the other end. And then she said, "Oh my God, she's doing it again." Her name was Michelle, and 2 years before Vanessa ever met my husband, Vanessa had done almost the exact same thing to Michelle's marriage, worked her way close to Michelle's husband at a previous company, positioned herself as endlessly understanding, orchestrated an affair, and, according to Michelle, had specifically targeted men who ran their own businesses or held senior leadership positions. Men with money, men with power, men who could give her a life she felt she was owed. I sat in my car after that call for almost an hour, because up until that moment, some small, exhausted part of me had still been telling myself this was a strange, singular, one-time collapse of judgment, a terrible mistake, but a human one. Learning it was a pattern, a strategy, something Vanessa had refined and repeated, changed everything. This wasn't heartbreak anymore. This was a con, and I had just found the previous mark. Michelle agreed to give a sworn statement if it ever came to that. She also gave me something I hadn't even thought to ask for: screenshots she'd kept 2 years old of messages between her ex-husband and Vanessa that were disturbingly, almost word for word similar to the ones I'd found from my own marriage. Same phrases, same manufactured sympathy, same manipulative script, just with a different name typed into it. I remember thinking with a kind of cold clarity I hadn't felt before, she's not going to see this coming, not even a little. By this point, I had it all: the financial fraud documentation, the dissipation of assets case, the shareholder vote ready to trigger, the temporary restraining order drafted and ready to file, a pattern of behavior from Vanessa that, while not the center of my legal case, I intended to make very publicly known at exactly the right moment, and an attorney who told me in our final planning meeting, "Rachel, when you're ready to move, we can have this filed and served within 24 hours, the moment you say go." There was only one piece left: the timing. Mark's anniversary gala, the one I told you about at the very beginning of this story, was 3 weeks away. I knew, because Denise had overheard planning conversations at the office, that Mark intended to use that event to formally announce Vanessa's promotion to full partner in the agency, a public celebratory unveiling of the future of the company, in front of every major client, every employee, every person who mattered in his professional world. He was going to stand in front of 200 people and elevate the woman he'd been secretly funding with stolen company money for over a year, at an event celebrating the very business built on the foundation I helped him lay. My attorney looked at me across her desk when I told her the date and just smiled, a small, sharp smile, and said, "Well, I think we know exactly when we're filing." I sat back in my chair, and for the first time in 3 months, I felt something other than grief. I felt ready. He thought he was about to have the biggest night of his career. He had no idea it was about to become the night his entire life came apart, in front of everyone who'd ever respected him. And he had absolutely no idea I was the one holding the match. But what happened next, he never saw coming. The night of the gala, I got ready slowly, deliberately. I want to tell you about the dress because it matters more than it sounds like it should. It was navy blue, a color I'd never worn to one of Mark's events before because he always used to tell me I looked better in warmer tones. I bought it specifically for that night. Small thing. It mattered to me. My attorney and I had everything staged with military precision: the paperwork, the divorce petition, the request for emergency temporary orders freezing joint accounts, the shareholder notice triggering the misconduct vote, was all finalized, signed, and ready. A process server, someone my attorney trusted completely, was on standby a few blocks from the venue. The plan was simple in its structure, even though building it had taken 3 months of my life. I would let the night unfold exactly as Mark intended, right up until the moment he stood at that podium to announce Vanessa's promotion. And then, before he could finish that sentence, I was going to make sure the entire room learned the truth instead. I arrived separately from Mark, told him I had a hair appointment running late, which wasn't even really a lie, just incomplete information. When I walked into that ballroom, the one I described to you at the very start of this story, I felt something settle over me that I can only describe as calm, not numbness. Calm. The kind of calm you feel after months of chaos, finally arriving at the moment you've been preparing for. I found Denise near the entrance. She'd agreed to be there for me, quietly, as a friend, and she squeezed my hand and whispered, "You've got this." I watched Mark move through the room, greeting clients, laughing, glowing with the kind of confidence that only comes from thinking you've gotten away with something. I watched Vanessa across the room in a red dress, sipping champagne, glancing at Mark with a kind of proprietary satisfaction that made my skin crawl, now that I understood exactly what I was looking at. She thought she'd already won. I could see it on her face. She thought this night was the beginning of her new life, the successful, powerful boyfriend, the partnership title, the whole trophy she'd spent over a year quietly assembling. She had absolutely no idea what was in the folder sitting in my attorney's car, 3 blocks away, engine running. Mark tapped his glass around 9:40 p.m. The room quieted. He climbed the small stage at the front, microphone in hand. That same easy charm from the day I met him tripping over a conference table still fully intact, still working its magic on a room full of people who trusted him. 12 years ago, he began, I started this company with 2 folding tables and a laptop that crashed more than it worked. Laughter, warm laughter. I remember it so clearly. And I want to take a second tonight to thank the people who made that dream real. My incredible team. Our incredible clients. He paused, scanning the room. And then I watched this happen in real time. His eyes found mine. Briefly, and he smiled at me like I was still simply his wife, simply part of his success story. And tonight, he continued, I'm thrilled to announce a huge next step for this agency, someone who has become an essential part of our growth over the last 2 years. Please join me in congratulating our newest full partner. I stood up. I want you to understand, I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I walked, calm and deliberate toward the small stage, while 200 people watched in confused silence, and I said, clearly into the quiet room, before you finish that sentence, Mark, I think everyone deserves to know how that partnership was actually funded. His face. I will remember his face for the rest of my life. The color draining out of it in real time, the exact moment his brain caught up to what was happening. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply said, for the last 14 months, my husband has been diverting company funds that belong in part to me and to the other shareholders in this room tonight, to finance an affair with the woman he was just about to promote, including an apartment lease, including hotel stays he coded as client entertainment, including gifts he charged to this company's account. I turned, briefly, to Vanessa, who was standing frozen near the edge of the stage, her champagne glass halfway to her mouth, her face somewhere between shock and fury. And for anyone wondering if this is the first time she's done this, I'd encourage you to ask her about a company called Brannigan Media 2 years ago and a man named David Ferris. His ex-wife would be happy to fill you in. I watched, in real time, the exact moment the room understood what they were witnessing. Employees exchanging glances, clients, actual, major clients, the kind of people whose trust an agency depends on, pulling out their phones, whispering to each other. The 2 other shareholders, Mark's brother and the family friend, standing quietly by the bar, already fully briefed, already aligned with me, watching without a single flicker of surprise. And then, right on cue, because timing was everything, and my attorney had this choreographed to the minute, the process server walked calmly through the front doors of the ballroom and asked, in a clear, professional voice, for Mark by his full legal name. 200 people watched my husband get served divorce papers, a temporary restraining order freezing every joint and business account he had access to, and formal shareholder notice of an emergency vote on his removal as managing partner due to documented financial misconduct, all in the same 5 minutes he had planned to spend announcing his mistress's promotion.
I want you to sit with that image for a second, because I sat with it for months, in planning meetings, in sleepless nights, in that parking lot the day I found out about Michelle. And when it finally happened, exactly the way I'd planned it, it felt like something inside my chest finally, fully exhaled for the first time in over a year. Here's a moment I know some of you have been waiting for, and I can't believe this moment, but a good one this time. As the process server handed Mark the documents, Vanessa, visibly panicking, visibly realizing the promotion she'd been promised, the title, the money, the life she'd been quietly building for over a year, turned to Mark and, in front of everyone, hissed, "You told me the business was going to be fine. You told me she didn't even know." She'd just confirmed out loud in front of 200 witnesses that she knew the entire time exactly what she was participating in. That's number one. If you're keeping score of the yes moments I promised you, that's your first one. Now, I won't pretend the fallout was instant or clean. Real life rarely is. But I'll walk you through what happened in the weeks and months after that night, because the payoff is worth every bit of the wait. The shareholder vote happened within 10 days, with Mark's brother, the family friend, and my combined 17%, plus the additional support we gathered from 2 senior employees who'd also been given small equity stakes over the years and were disgusted by what they'd learned. The vote to remove Mark as managing partner passed with a clear majority. He remained a shareholder. The company's operating agreement didn't allow full expulsion without a much longer legal process, but he lost control of daily operations, decision-making, and, critically, signing authority on company accounts. The forensic accounting report I'd commissioned became the backbone of both the divorce proceedings and a separate internal company investigation. It documented with total precision over $81,000 in diverted company funds over 14 months. Under the terms of dissipation of assets law in our state, that entire amount was clawed back into the marital estate and counted heavily against Mark's share of our divorce settlement. Combined with my 8% equity stake, which, given the company's growth over the previous decade, had become worth significantly more than either of us had ever really discussed, and the $18,000 loan from all those years ago, which, technically, under the original agreement, accrued interest that had never been paid, I walked into settlement negotiations with a financial position Mark never saw coming. I kept the house. I kept my full equity position in the company, which, once Mark was removed from daily control, the other shareholders and I voted to restructure. Mark's controlling share was diluted through a mechanism in the original operating agreement that accounted for proven misconduct by a managing partner, something my attorney had specifically identified and built our whole strategy around months earlier. Mark walked away from that marriage and from the company he'd built from 2 folding tables and a broken laptop with roughly a third of what he'd walked in with. That's number 2. Say it with me if you want to. Yes. Now, here's the twist I promised you, the one I genuinely did not see coming, even after everything. About 6 weeks after the gala, once the settlement negotiations were well underway and Mark's professional reputation had taken a very public hit, several of the agency's biggest clients pulled their contracts once the story made its way around our industry, which, small world that it is, it absolutely did. Vanessa left him. Not quietly, not gently. According to Demise, who still worked at the agency and still occasionally updated me even after everything, Vanessa realized within weeks that the partnership, the money, the lifestyle she'd spent over a year cultivating was gone. Mark, stripped of his controlling stake, tangled up in expensive legal proceedings, was no longer the man she'd calculated him to be worth destroying a marriage for. So she left. For someone new, apparently, a different company, a different city, according to what I later heard, doing, I have to assume, exactly what she'd done to Michelle and exactly what she'd done to me. Mark called me during this period, in a moment of what I can only describe as genuine, desperate collapse. He told me he'd made the worst mistake of his life. He told me he understood now what he'd thrown away. He asked, and I want you to hear this because I think it says everything about how some people never actually learn. He asked if there was any chance, after everything settled, that we could talk about starting over.
I told him no. I told him calmly, the same way I'd told the room at that gala the truth, that I didn't hate him. I genuinely don't, not anymore. But that the version of him I loved for 14 years had made a choice, over and over again for more than a year, and that choice had consequences that didn't get undone just because the woman he made it for had also, eventually, discarded him. That's number 3, if you're still counting. Yes. I want to tell you where things stand now because I think it matters. I still live in that house, the one we renovated together room by room, though I've since made it entirely my own. New paint, new furniture in the living room, a garden I planted myself last spring that I am absurdly proud of. I still hold my equity stake in the company, which under new leadership has continued to grow, which I'll admit gives me a very specific, very satisfying kind of validation every single quarter when I review the numbers. Biscuit is doing great, by the way, still sleeps at the foot of my bed every night. Mark and I are, believe it or not, cordial now. Not close, not friends, but cordial in the practical, low-drama way that two people manage when there's still a shared business history between them. I've made peace with that. I've made peace with a lot. But I never made peace with pretending it didn't happen, and I never made peace with the idea that I should have reacted immediately, emotionally, without a plan. I think about that decision, the decision to sit at that kitchen table and choose strategy over screaming, as one of the best decisions I have ever made in my life. Because it wasn't just about revenge, even though I know that's the word most people would use for this story. It was about making sure that when the truth finally came out, it came out entirely on my terms, backed by evidence no one could argue with, in a way that protected everything I'd worked for. Let's take a moment before I wrap this up. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this story, it's this. Pain doesn't have to make you reckless. It can make you precise. I understand the instinct to want to burn everything down the second you find out someone has betrayed you. I felt that instinct too, sitting on my kitchen floor with my dog's head in my lap, completely shattered. But I learned through this whole experience that the most powerful thing you can do in a moment like that isn't the loudest thing, it's the smartest thing. I didn't get my life back by yelling in a parking lot or sending an angry text I'd regret. I got it back by being patient, by documenting everything, by finding my allies quietly, one by one, by understanding fully what I was legally and financially entitled to before I ever tipped my hand, and by choosing the moment of truth on my own terms instead of letting someone else choose it for me. If you're going through something like this right now, and I know some of you are because I read every comment on these videos, please talk to a lawyer before you talk to anyone else. Document everything you can, legally and carefully. Find your Denise. Find your forensic accountant. Build your case before you show your hand. You deserve to walk into the hardest moment of your life already holding every card. I want to leave you with this. That woman in the red dress thought she'd won the night she walked into that gala. She thought she was about to become a partner in every sense of the word. She had absolutely no idea that the quiet woman in the navy blue dress by the bar had already spent 3 months making sure that night would be the beginning of her undoing instead. Don't ever assume the person who's been hurt is the weak one in the room. Sometimes we're just the ones taking our time. I'd genuinely love to know what you would have done in my position. Would you have confronted him the second you found that hotel charge? Would you have played the long game the way I did? Comment below. I read every single one, and honestly, some of your stories from previous videos have stayed with me for weeks. If this story meant something to you, if you felt even a little bit of that yes moment along with me, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because I've got more stories like this one coming, and trust me, some of them get even wilder than this. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. Take care of yourselves, and if you're in the middle of your own version of this story right now, hang in there. Your version of that gala moment is coming.